That's why a quarter of the people dying don't tell a story. Yeah, walk in any building and you'll see somebody who can't hold a lousy door open without having to bow his head in condolence. Why can't more people be like you? From the moment I slid my pawn over, you were hell-bent on getting the best of me. See how you got my queen stuck, molded on both sides where I can't go nowhere? Why can't more people be like that? Have them tell it. They say, Mr. Murray needed us to barge right up to that restaurant's window pane. He needed somebody to stand up to those law books and demand his rights. Who else was gonna yell for him? Poor Mr. Murray and his sad and battered life. Mind you, did they take any time to the consulting of me? Did it ever cross anyone's mind that this might require my blessing? So I say, fine, don't consult me, but don't get irate if I sit by myself and have no part of it. My apartment is such that I can watch my shows while smelling what deliciousness the Africans is cooking across the hall. I can look out the window and see down the avenue and then take a warm shower and think about life for the 15 minutes of heat it allows. My bed is low enough I can roll out of it with no injury and disappear into my own pot of coffee. I got a box fan on the sill aimed right at my favorite chair when I sit down. So inside or outside, it don't make much difference anyway. I can stay indoors much longer than I can keep my head underwater. Wouldn't take but a switch in my head to bolt my door, which is what I did. And I would have stayed put had it not been a few nights before when I closed my eyes and dreamt of a ghost that turned into Mr. Benjamin Banneker himself. Go ahead and diagnose me. Standing before me like a hologram, he said he taught himself letters and could trace his blood back to the coast. And still, all he got in his name is crumbling walls. I woke up and said to myself, ain't that a fact? Even when your name is in front of a building, they treat you like something that's never lived. I had had enough, I tell you, of all these so-called friends pretending they knew what was in my heart and in my id. Can you picture that? Every Tom, Dick, and Janet thinking you got nothing because a corner was snatched up from under you. I was going to show them what it felt like to have all your business out there by walking down there and putting everybody else's business out there. And I wasn't blinking twice about it. 24 tenants, mobbing them on a perfect summer day meant for kayaking. Standing right by the entrance to the restaurant with signs and loudspeakers. Emeraldine was there and her lackeys. Philippa, Juanita, and a couple of others who I wouldn't have known from a spot in the rug. It was acting like it was a goddamn picnic. Brought water coolers with them and chips. Even the patrons were scared to open the door because of them. Give us our sidewalks back, was what they were shouting. Respect what was here before. A block of linked arms and grunting. The bougies dining by the hedges heard it all, as did the gentlemen inside and the ladies with them. I marched right up in the middle of that. You should have seen how I had them at full attention. I stood right in front of that entrance tent and I says, listen up. And here goes, sorry, Miss Emeraldine, talking about, hush, hush, everybody. Mr. Murray has something real important to say. I was going to let it all spew. I was going to call out Juanita for claiming other people's kids. Philippa for the stuff her husband do. Miss Dallas for her situation. Everyone who's seen me on the streets and seen right through me. Then I was going to ask everyone out loud if they ever once stopped by to play me. I was really about to do it. But then I took a look at those faces, the swarms of goodwill in them, open like the purest of lakes, ready for me to pat them on the shoulder and let them know they've done all right. I suddenly became too much of a pussyfoot to take that all the way. I just want to show some appreciation for all this, I said instead. Thank you. And I continue to be the sweet Mr. Murray everyone wanted me to be, so they could commence to stroking each other's feathers, taking black and white photos, and say, although that they didn't get me back on that block, they did file the ordinance in my name for this side of the street, the same one we on now. Say, I have a favor to ask. I feel bad coming over the hill and blindsiding you like this. I really do. But I got to before we're done here. I know you be in that restaurant carousing with those who recognize you by name. You enjoying the World Cup, enjoying the election. You seem like the type, if you said something reasonable, the rest would break their heads nodding to it. See, that day, when all that cahooting was going on, I didn't lack for one match the whole rest of the afternoon. It was a fine day. I mean, really fine. It was then, with that little crowd around me, I had a vision. All of us out here, every Saturday, playing. It wouldn't be nothing fancy. You showed up humble, play somebody to the brink, and then shake hands. I even got one of the young bloods to go to 135th Goodwill for boards. The board you see under me right now. Let me just come out with it. The bus don't let out on this side. Of the hundreds who empty that restaurant every day, you were about one of the only few who ever thought to cross the street. Next time you in there with your buddies drinking a glass of the finest, could you lean in and ask them what they got going on in the way of recreation? If they enjoy things that work the brain and open the heart? If yes, tell them to cross the street and check me out. They wouldn't be sorry they did. Anyhow, regardless of how this goes, I'm grateful for the time. This sure is a beautiful city, isn't it? Don't worry, I can carry everything back with me. See the board stacked in a crate like this, and the table folds up and the legs guide me home. Anyhow, promise you'll do what I said. Weekdays after sundown, you hear? And Saturdays past noon. The end.
So Sadiq said he'd be willing to answer some questions if you have them. We can do that for a few minutes if anybody has any questions.
I got one. It's about your, your word choice and sprinkling cliche, ombre, you ironic. That's it.
Yeah. No, word choice. I mean, just for writing stories in vernacular, I feel like, if writers are again, my whole thing in life is like, I feel tempted to make general statements, and then I take a step back and I'm like, all right, let me just say what I feel. So if any writers are like me, you're secretly like, you're like, it'd be cool if I write something decent, But like in your head, you're like, I want to write something that everybody's gonna like, 100%. And then with writing vernacular, it's almost like you're doomed to like not have that happen. Like people are either gonna really like the, directness, the authenticity of it, or people are gonna be like, that's not standard, or why, and so I just, for every character in this book, I would say at least two people that are like the composites, and for this it's my best friend's great uncle, and also my father-in-law. I've never told my father-in-law that it's based on him because he would just brag too much. Like, see, that's. But he talks like that. He's just like, he's always reflecting on the past, and he's always there's just like a slight like complaining tone, but in an endearing way. And some of the word choice, it's like, as a writer myself, like sometimes I cringe because I'm having my characters say things that I wouldn't necessarily say, that I would check myself with, and but then these characters say it, and I read it out loud, and it's like, yeah. So I had to be 100% true to like the endearment, like the endearing tone of it, and the like harmless complaining, but then also like the slightly politically incorrect things he would say, and so it's just a matter of that, and I promise not to be like, well, I didn't say it. Mr. Murray said it, but yeah, it's just kind of listening. I think a lot of the editing of this was just like editing myself out. Like I would just write things, and I would like, this is a metaphor that Sadiq would use, and then I'd be like, well, is it a metaphor that Miss Dallas would use, or Najee, or Mr. Murray would use? And I'd have to like take it out. And then part of it also was, I was sometimes fascinated by what characters said. It's like, there's a couple of lines that I took like verbatim from like conversations I overheard. And one of my favorite lines in a story that seems to get like a tickle out of people sometimes is, there's a character in Light Feet who the kids are roasting each other, and one of them says like, your breath smells like Jesus' sandals, and like, I wish I came up with that. I so wish, but like one of my students said that, and I was like, dude. So like, it always reminds me that like, no one owns storytelling. No one owns like the gift of wielding language, and so yeah, it's a process of like listening, and then kind of taking a step back as an author, and just allowing the voice to come out in however the purest way I feel like it comes out. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
So I know you said something about editing yourself out, but what do you think is the biggest difference, because you've been writing this for 15 years, from the original versus the final product?
Ooh, yeah, I would love to talk about that. The biggest difference was, I think right off the top, was just length. Like the book clocks in at like a little over 200 pages. At some point it was like 250. And a story like this, The Federation and Like Minded, that story at one point was like 40, 50 pages. And I worked on that for several years. And it's interesting, earlier this afternoon I was asking Chris like, how long did he work on the Throwback Special, and he said the answer could be either 2 years or 5 years. And like, I understand, because it's like the time from when you're like actually writing versus the time where you're thinking about things, processing things, it could be two different things. And so, with a story like The Federation of like, forgot the title. Anyway, with that story, it started off with a different title, and it started off as a whole different story. Like, I wanted to portray an older person, but the story I had him in was he was going to part of New York City known as Soho, which is like a very like, you know, sprawling, like luxurious part where you can do like some luxury shopping. And he wanted to get a designer breed dog, and you know, just being in a totally different like environment. And you know, that's the story I wanted to tell about Mr. Murray, but it wasn't quite clicking. And then I was just like, you know what? You know, especially when I lived in Harlem, there was definitely like the most vivacious characters would be on the afternoon, like, you know, playing chess. It's like, I wonder if I could like capture that. And I did that story, and that was like 40 to 50 pages because it was like a whole like, you know, year in his life. It was also like, it had a crescendo of like Black Lives Matter almost. It was like, it got a little too like melodramatic where somebody stood up for him and then the cops intervened and then that person like was violently like killed, and just like a, you know, I wanted like portray more of a slice of life thing. And so, you know, trimming that story all the way down took years, and a lot of stories started off as really long, and it took a long time. Another big difference was it took years for it to become a story of voices. It was just like, first started off like, wouldn't it be cool to write something like how characters talk? But then, and it was like every now and then, I'll do that, you know, and I'll mostly write standard prose, you know, because I want people to read something and be like, Sadiq wrote that. That's Sadiq's words. But after a while, I was just like, you know what? If the book's going to be called Stories from the Tenants Downstairs, it has to be like tenant speaking and whatnot. So getting rid of like the standard prose was another big difference. Setting it all in New York City was another difference because I'm from Boston, and I moved to New York at 18. So book started off as like half Boston, half New York, and then it went all the way to New York. It's been a long, perilous journey, and you know, a lot of the stories scared me. And sometimes people are like, well, how did you end up like showing a story like Light Feet, which is about the kids dancing on the train, or Camaraderie, where, you know, a character is in a real compromising position. And I wrote them at first, especially with the school stories, because I'm a school teacher. I was like, I'm not gonna write about school. I'm never gonna write about school. Never. And then I'm like, I'm writing about school. I'm writing about school, and I was just like, in the way I justified writing, I was like, nobody's ever gonna read this, so, you know, like, I'll just write it. And that kind of allowed me to just keep writing and whatnot. But yeah, it's been a long journey. I think about Jonathan Safran Foer, who, when I was at NYU, he was my thesis advisor, and he came to visit my ninth graders, and one of my ninth graders asked, like, how did you come up with the idea for Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close? And he said he was working on an entirely different book, and he would take breaks and write about this character, Oscar, and he said, you know, it would be like his side project, but then every now and more he's like, oh, this world is kind of cool, I want to be in this world. So you never know where it takes you. It could take you a decade and a half. Okay, yeah.
I was just gonna ask, was it hard to kind of keep the faith over all those years?
Yeah, it was hard, and it was harder at the very end. You know, my metaphor for the first few years was I called it my Rubik's Cube, and you know, I've never in my life solved a Rubik's Cube, never. And it's just like, hopefully, you know, you just keep tinkering around with it, and if there's any joy in it, it's just in the tinkering around it with the possibility that you could solve it. And so I would refer to that project as my Rubik's Cube, and it's, I mean, you know, the overused one analogy is like the race, running the race. And it's interesting, you know, I'm not much of a runner. I think the most I've ever run in my life was like maybe 5 miles, and I was just dog tired after that. But no matter if I'm running a mile, a half mile, even if it's a half mile, towards the end, it feels like I can't finish, you know, like it feels like, oh my God, I can't make it. I don't know what the psychology behind that is. And that was the same for this book. In 2019, I was just like, I'm done. I'm done trying to figure this out. I'm gonna put it aside. And I'm gonna go back to my true passion, which is being a rapper. And at 36 years old, it's like, that's like doom right there. And I was just like, you know what? I feel comfortable writing raps. I'm just gonna write raps for myself, you know? And, you know, I was talking to fellow writers this afternoon, and my agent was like, let's send it out, which he never says. And, you know, that was the start of the journey. But yeah, it takes, you know, as we all know, I'm in a room full of writers and creators. Like, it's a solitary vocation, and you just keep at it. And from this vantage point of just having published, I thought like, my insecurities have gone away, but they haven't. You know, I think before I was published, I would be like, I'd go to readings, I'd look at the lists, look at the contemporary classics, and I'd be like, everybody who's doing this has already been selected, and there's no room for me. You know, they've already selected the best of the best. Can't break into this profession. But now, standing here, I'm like, oh, they only gonna give me 1 month, and they gonna look for the next person. You know, it's like my editor. You know, when your editor buys your book, you're like, yeah, it's me and you. And then you're reading in Publishers Weekly, Kathy Belden has acquired another book, and you're happy for that person, but you're like, really? Kathy, a month? You couldn't stay with me for a month. And so from this vantage point, it's like, yeah, train keeps moving, and they're always looking for that next person. So yeah. There was a question back here.
Yeah, you talked about rap.
Yeah.
Also earlier in the day. But I was wondering also about who helped shape how you sound in terms of like your literary influences, like who gave you permission?
Yeah. I love the question about literary influences, because I know there are writers who are like my direct influences. And then there are a bunch of writers who, like, I have no idea, but they probably are, like, you know, subtle, subconscious influences. And before, when, like, I would answer that question, I'd answer it as, like, who are my favorite writers? But now I like to answer it as, like, you know, I say who my favorite writers are, and then I would say, like, who's in my literary DNA, so to speak. And so my favorite writers would be Richard Wright. It would be, you know, classic public school teacher Frank McCourt, Jose Saramago, Edward P. Jones, Jhumpa Lahiri, Sherman Alexie. And then in terms of people who it's like, without them, there would be no me, or like I'm just like a poor man's version of them, is, you know, Sapphire, who wrote Push, which became the movie Precious. Toni Cade Bambara, who wrote stories about people in Harlem too, with voice. And when Toni Morrison was an editor, Toni Cade Bambara was one of the writers that she helped publish. And so Toni Cade Bambara, there's Junot Diaz, there's you know, Alice Walker, And then, you know, those are the writers of color. But then there's an American tradition of telling stories in voice, and it goes back to Ring Lardner, you know, who, you know, old time writer, deserves to be resurrected. I mean, he is resurrected, but even more so in terms of American voice. George Saunders, and so anyone who's like dealing with the how people speak, how they bend language, when the writing is not a transcript written down, but we're just hearing it. And then also have rap influences that heavily influence my fiction. Andre 3000, Kendrick Lamar, J. Cole, Lauryn Hill. These are all people who like I converse with. But yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah.
It's totally off topic.
Yeah.
I'm talking about voices. Faulkner.
Yeah, Faulkner, you know, and I haven't, my extent of Faulkner, I read, when I was 18, I read Light in August, because I wanted to be a good English student. And so, like, that's the last thing I read of Faulkner, but it's interesting, when I was writing this book, I had a whole list of books that I would read to be influenced by. And so on that list was Sherwood Anderson, Winesburg, Ohio. Like a lot of them I got to, like The Women of Brewster Place, and one of the books on that list was As I Lay Dying. And so I would like open it up and read a few pages, but I haven't gotten back to Faulkner as a literary adult. So I would, you know, I'm interested to see like, you know, how I would take his work in now versus when I was 18. Oh yeah, Baldwin, yeah, definitely. And Baldwin, like, he wrote an essay about teachers and I was like, you're not a teacher and you get it. Yeah, Baldwin, definitely. Another big one as a public school teacher, Langston Hughes, big. Like, and Langston Hughes, it's complicated with Langston Hughes, and when I think about, and also Zora Neale Hurston, it's interesting writing in dialect, writing in voice. You know, if anyone is like wants to pursue that, get ready for the darts. Get ready for the darts. And so whenever I'm feeling down, I think about not trying to be like Langston Hughes or Zora Neale Hurston, but I think about how they were received in their lifetime. So whenever people are like, you know, I don't know, I think about Zora Neale Hurston in that when she wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, it got favorable news coverage. It wasn't a bestseller at all, and the other writers came for her. Other writers were like, why are you writing this? Like, you know, why are you portraying this like the dialect like this? And she wrote a few books, but she died in penury. She died broke in a grave that was unmarked. And that would have been it for Zora Neale Hurston. We would not be reading her today if Alice Walker didn't publish a magazine article called Looking for Zora. And in that article, she had one simple goal, was to find Zora Neale Hurston's grave and to mark it. And so that article just renewed a lot of interest in her work. And I think about, you know, how she was received then versus how she was received then versus now. It's interesting. Langston Hughes, same thing. Like Langston Hughes, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm notorious for being blasphemous with the greats, right? And I will say this because I love Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes, he's a hit or miss guy. He's a hit or miss guy. Like when he gets it, it's like I too am America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat when company comes, but I eat well and I grow strong. Like, whoo, whoo. But then like other ones be like nursery rhymes, like really good. And I'll say that, and you could be like, Sadiq, come on now, you wrote one little book and you talking about this, right? Like, but the written documents are there. The other writers are like, I forget who it was who was just like, there's not much of the intellectual rigor that belongs to a poet. Like someone wrote, I want to say, who was it? It was one of the greats, one of the Harlem Renaissance greats said that. And I think about what was written about him then versus, at least in public school, you can't graduate from public school in New York City and have not read one Langston Hughes poem. You know, Mother to Son, or even the short story Thank You Ma'am. Like, so it's like, you know, I think about this a lot. I think about in the moment, how writers are received in the moment. Who gets attention, who becomes a bestseller, who wins an award. And then 25, 30 years from now, like how that changes. Like, it's weird. Like, you know, I hope everyone who's getting attention now still gets attention 50 years from now. But if it's anything like the past, you'll be like, whoa, it's totally different. Like, one of my favorite things to do is look up classics and look up like whether they were on bestseller lists or awards, and it's fascinating. You know, Catcher in the Rye didn't win a National Book Award, it lost. Sula was lost a National Book Award. Like, it's interesting. And so there's a lot of politics behind who reads what and, you know, things like that. But, you know, it's interesting. But I love the greats. And they influence me. But I continue to poke at them every now and then and ask questions too. Yeah.
Maybe one more?
Okay.
You mentioned the Harlem Renaissance and Sula, which is a novel that is like very much so about place, and Richard Wright, a novelist who the places he writes in are very much characters as well as the characters themselves. How do you think that the place of Harlem and New York City shaped your storytelling?
Oh yeah, it shaped it a lot, and I was very aware of the gravity, the value of that place in the literary landscape. I'm not even gonna lie, like, oh, I just happened to write about Harlem. Like, it wasn't that. It was like definitely like, oh, and it was an honor and it was exciting, but then it was also like scary, you know, because it's like I could not write one word about Harlem, and the literature about Harlem is good enough to sustain. And so I was very aware when I was writing about that. I'm also aware about just kind of the like conversations we have nowadays about place, about identity, about who gets to write about a place, who gets to write about a certain identity. And nowadays, at least on the business hand, it seems like the author's bio is like an extension of the marketing. It's like, so-and-so grew up here and they're writing about here, so they're authentic, so you should buy it, you know? And I think about the Harlem Renaissance, and I think when we think about the Harlem Renaissance, we think about County Cullen, we think about Claude McKay, we think about Langston Hughes, we think about Zora Neale Hurston. How many of them were actually from Harlem, you know? You know, Langston Hughes was from Joplin, Missouri. You know, I think nowadays, maybe you might get some pushback from the editor, like, maybe you should write about Joplin, you know? Right? Like, because then we could say you're from Joplin, and like, you know? But now we just kind of assure we kind of just associate him with Harlem. It's blasphemous to be like, oh, Langston Hughes was not authentic. But you know, he is a Harlem. And I'm kind of like that Issa Rae from Insecure, where she's like saying all these aggressive raps to the mirror. So I always have these like aggressive like battle responses about, because I think about that. I'm from Boston, the child of immigrants, and so my story is supposed to be like, I write a story about being a child of immigrants in Boston and growing up and having parents that are from Sierra Leone, and I love that story. I do. I love it, but I thought we were writing fiction out here, that's one of my mirror battles. I'm like, I thought we were writing fiction out here, and so, if I ever wanted to tell that story, it'd be a memoir. It'd be like, this is what happened, and this is not like any subliminals for people who are doing that, because those people's books are in my house and I read them and I love them. But for me, I'm like, I want, it's the insider outsider thing. Like, these are people I grew up with, people I've interacted with, but then there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And so, Harlem, I definitely just know it as like that place where it has high literary value, and it's an opportunity to talk about things that are going on in American cities across the country. And it's scary to like interact with that place, but I'm willing to dare. So thank you for that question, and thank you all for listening to this. I really appreciate you.
Thank you all again for coming. Please come back to other events. Really appreciate you coming out tonight. There's books out here. Get a book, and so we can sign for you, I think. Yeah.
Oh.